Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jakub Gałęziowski, and here is Katarzyna Bok-Matuszyk. On behalf of the local organizing committee and the Polish Oral History Association, we are delighted to welcome you to the 23rd International Oral History Association Conference. We extend a warm welcome to all participants gathered here in Auditorium Maximum of Jagiellonian University, as well as to those joining us via live stream.
It is a great honor for us that nearly 400 people from 55 countries around the world accepted our invitation to rethink oral history in the light of the challenges of the modern world, and that over the course of these few days we will have the opportunity to listen to, present, and discuss so many interesting issues related to oral history.
We are here to meet and listen to one another. Our stories and experiences matter, and this is a space where we can share them. We hope these 4 days will be a time for attentive, empathetic, and sensitive listening, but also of critical reflection and meaningful dialogue. Let this space be where the silence and suppressed voices can be heard, something especially vital today in an era marked by growing conflicts, divisions, and misinformation. Many of the topics we will engage with are not easy, to mention only Ukraine, Gaza, but the true value lies in the fact that we are here together.
The organization of the Oral History Celebration in Kraków wouldn't be possible without you all, participants of the conference, but also without the numerous institutions and organizations involved in organization of this event. At this point, I would like to officially welcome and thank International Oral History Association, represented by its president, Dawid Beorlegi. Sorry, we haven't practiced this. Organizer, together with Polish Oral History Association of this conference, Jagiellonian University, represented here by His Magnificence Vice Rector, Professor Bartosz Brożek. As well as the deans of the Faculty of History, Professor Stanisław Sroka and Professor Sławomir Sprawski. And Director of the Institute of History, Professor Janusz Mierzwa. This conference is organized under the patronage of His Magnificence Director, Professor Piotr Jedynak. We welcome and thank two co-organizers and partners of this event. The Center of Community Archives, represented by Katarzyna Ziental. The Remembrance and Future Center, represented by Professor Wojciech Kucharski. European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, represented by Professor Ewelina Szpak. Polish State Archives, represented by Danuta Płukasz and Ewelina Gołębiowska. And Oral History commissioned by the Committee of Historical Sciences of the Polish Academy of Science. We would like to express our special thanks to the Polish Ministry of Science and Higher Education, which supported the organization of the event financially from the state budget, and to Minister Marcin Kulasek himself, who took honorary patronage of this event. There will be many thanks today. We would like to thank to Mayor of Kraków, Aleksander Miszalski, represented today by Jacek Liguziński, the Director of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Innovation in the City Hall of Kraków. 4, free public transport in Kraków for participants of this conference, free admission to museums, thanks to the Museum of Kraków, guided tours with the contribution of Kraków Convention Bureau, and distribution of Kraków tap water through Kraków Water, as well as for the wine for today's welcome reception. The Mayor of Kraków also has given his patronage to this event.
We would like to invite Professor Bartosz Brożek, Vice Rector of the Jagiellonian University, the host of this venue, to speak on behalf of the organizers.
Well, hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here in Krakow and at the Jagiellonian University. I have to say that it is a great privilege and honor for us to host here such a formidable assemble of people working on oral history. I've been thinking what to say in order to do something along the lines of the main theme of your conference, Rethinking Oral History. I'm not a historian, so I'm afraid I cannot contribute to your reflection in your field of specialization. However, when I think of oral history, and in particular when I think of oral culture, some things from my fields come to mind. So I decided to share a few thoughts coming from my background, which may be relevant for what you are doing in your daily job and what you will be discussing during the next 3 days. So one of my fields is law. And when you think of the law, you think of something which is text-based. So some people even say that law is the empire of text. However, if you know something about the history of law, one of the most important events in the history of how we regulate human behavior, social interactions, was the change from the law which was not written into the written law. It made an important changes in the society. However, as it turns out, we were unable to get rid of the oral aspect here, or on the interactions with others. The law is not only the text, and throughout the history of law there are some big controversies, like, for instance, whether justice can be served when the decision of a court is based purely on documents. And the opinion of people who think of it is that it is impossible. So in order to have justice, you need interactions, you need people speaking to one another. The text is not enough. Another field of my specialization is philosophy. And when you think of philosophy and the oral versus written history, or oral versus written culture, the first name which comes to mind is Plato. Plato lived at a very interesting time when there was this big change from oral to written history. It is even reflected in the form of Plato's treatises, which are dialogues, of course. They are written, but at the same time the form is dialogical. But the interesting thing is that according to the historians of philosophy, the most important teachings of Plato have never been entrusted to the written text. People say that the so-called unwritten philosophy of Plato was only passed on through speaking to selected people, of course. This is very interesting because it says that somewhere very deep in our human nature there is a kind of distrust to what is written. We can gain trust in what we learn when we interact with people speaking to us, explaining things to us. This leads me to my third field of specialization, which is cognitive science. And when you look at cognitive science today, in the last 40 or 50 years, we have witnessed a big paradigm change in the way we understand the functioning of the human mind. The change is surely connected with what constitutes the basic elements of how we interact with the world. And here again, there are some interesting threads which suggest that our interacting with other people is what makes us human. That the fact that we can reason with the use of very abstract terms, or that we can write something, and we have very complex symbolic systems, is a kind of side effect of the main way our minds work, which is through interaction, through dialogue, through involving all our senses and having this very complex experience of each other and of the world. And this finally leads me to the question of the oral history versus other kinds of history, especially written history. If what I'm telling from the point of view of the three disciplines in which I know something, if this is even roughly true, it means that there can be no history without oral history. Because only when we can capture, in a way, this aspect of the historical experience of people, we can have a fuller, a richer picture of what has been the past. So that's my take on it, and I have to say that I envy you that you have this opportunity to speak for another a few days about those matters. I wish you very fruitful discussions, and please remember that each discussion you have instantly becomes an element of the oral history of the world. Thank you.
We now welcome Jacek Liguziński, the representative of the mayor of Kraków.
Thank you very much for the introduction and warmly welcome. Dignified guests, esteemed participants of the International Scientific Conference. On behalf of Aleksander Miszalski, Mayor of the City of Kraków, and myself, I extend a warm welcome to all of you attending the International Oral History Association. The atmosphere of our university, city with its centuries-old tradition, harmonizes with modernity, fosters the exchange of ideas, knowledge and experiences. For centuries, Kraków has not only remained open to new trends, but often created them. This is why discussing the challenges related to oral history and memory studies in the capital of the Małopolska region may yield many inspiring insights and research questions. Thanking you for your attendance, I wish you successful discussion and hope you will establish lasting connections with Krakow's academic community. Connections that will result in numerous international projects in the near and more distant future. Thank you very much.
We have also received a letter from the Minister of Science and Higher Education, Marcin Kulasek, the content of which I would like to read to you, translated from Polish. Dear President of Polish Oral History Association, thank you for inviting me to the 23rd Conference of the International Oral History Association. I also extend my appreciation to all involved in its organization. I'm pleased that this important event addressed the current challenges facing oral history. Bringing together researchers and activists from around the world, the conference offers a valuable platform for sharing ideas, experiences, and best practices. I believe the diverse perspectives presented will foster the meaningful dialogue and encourage further collaboration in the humanities and social sciences. Congratulations on this valuable initiative. I wish you continued inspiration and much success. With kind regards, Marcin Kulasek, Minister of Science and Higher Education. And last but not least, David Berlegui will give a welcome address on behalf of the association.
Okay. They asked me to speak in English because most of us are English speaking and the translation goes English to Spanish. So I will speak in English, okay? So dear colleagues, welcome. It is a pleasure to see you all here, to be here, and we give you a warm welcome. We would like to thank our colleagues from the Polish Oral History Association for their excellent work in organizing this event, and also the institutions that have collaborated in the conference: Jagiellonian University, Ministry of Science and Higher Education, the local archives, and all the people that Jakub just mentioned. It is a pleasure also to be in this beautiful city and in this very impressive hall, no? And we would like to have a special mention. First of all, personally, I would like to say thank you to Jacob, because he has been a key person here, the liaison between the IOHA and the local organizers. So thank you very much for all your work. Also, we would like to have a special mention to our colleagues who have been selected for the Travel Awards, because it is very important for us, in order to be a more diverse organization, to have you here. And finally, I would like also to have a special mention for two groups of colleagues. First, our colleagues from Ukraine, because I know that they had a difficult time making it to this event. It was not easy for some of them to come. And also to our Palestinian colleagues with whom we have been in contact, and they wanted to join us, but unfortunately they could not attend. And however, I hope they will be present here in our thoughts and mind. Well, this conference is an opportunity in a global context marked by increasing tensions and violence and a decline in academic freedom. We now have a few days ahead of us to think critically about our society, to meet, to listen, to respect one another, to get to know each other, and to form human and meaningful connections. I humbly believe that our association is an example of respect, inclusivity, and international spirit, and I really hope that each and every one of you has the opportunity to enrich one another in the coming days. I would also like to remind you that this afternoon we will hold the General Assembly. It is important that you come. We will report to members on the work we have been doing, and also elections will be held for the upcoming council. Later, we will enjoy a small gala, which includes also a concert organized by the local team, and it will be followed by the award ceremony and the announcement of the location for our next meeting in 2028. So having this said, I wish you all a very good conference. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy these days. Thank you very much.
We would also like to express some more gratitude to those who have been involved in organizing this conference for almost 2 years. We've been working on it. First and foremost, once again, we would like to thank International Oral History Association Council with David for trust, for giving us this opportunity to organize this event. To the members of the conference scientific committee led by Professor Barbara Klich-Kluczewska, we hope she's already here. To Mrs. Barbara Czerw from Jordan Congress Office for her logistical support, to Alina Doboszewska for serving as ombudsperson during this conference, and to Rzeczy Obrazkowe for the graphic designs of the conference materials. We would like to thank all those who helped in the organization of this event at various stages, including the students of the Faculty of History at the Jagiellonian University. And finally, from the bottom of our hearts, we would like to thank Jakub Gałęziowski, President of Polish Oral History Association. No, not yet. For always being on the front line, for driving us all to work, and for doing much more than necessary to take care of actually every single detail of organizing of this event. Thank you, Jakub.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank the fantastic team I've had the pleasure of working with throughout all this time. The members of the local organizing committee, because it's not a single person work, you know. So Ada, Marcin, Marek, Mariusz, and Kasia.
Please come here to us for a moment.
Just, I'd like to invite all of you here to show people who you are, because for next few days we are here for you. And if you have any questions, suggestions, just please come to talk to the fantastic team. Mariusz should be somewhere. He is a technician, and probably you dealt with many things, with technical things with Mariusz. We would like to also thank Gosia, who joined us just recently to support us with hundreds of emails. Gosia, come to... Kraków team.
And some more information. Throughout the conference, the reception desk will be open for you to obtain various information. Students will be present in each room to assist you during parallel sessions and help you to contact our technicians if it's necessary. We invite you to enjoy coffee breaks and share meals together. And the conference program is available in the application and on the website. We will keep you informed of any changes via notifications in the app. Urgent messages will be also sent to you this way. We hope it will all be a good time for all of us.
Thanks to the support of the Ministry of Science and Higher Education, all plenary events are being broadcast live on the YouTube channel of the Polish Oral History Association. After the conference, maybe this is important information, recordings will be available in English with Spanish subtitles, and this makes our conference truly global. We encourage you to share your impressions of the event on social media, photos, posts, reels, using the hashtags. I hope that they show the hashtags IOHA2025, Rethinking Oral History, and IOHA Kraków. And all updates and photos will be posted on the Facebook profile on the Polish Oral History Association. We invite to follow the website and like it. Yeah.
Okay, I would just like to correct the information. The General Assembly is tomorrow, not today. Okay. And
these are hashtags, yes. So please use them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in closing, we would like to use this opportunity to share a few words about ourselves and about oral history in Poland.
Bardzo Panią proszę o rozpoczęcie opowieści, a ja się zamieniam w słuch.
Czy ja mam podać nazwisko, czy...
Proszę się przedstawić, jak Pani uważa?
Historia mówiona to dla mnie doświadczenie, które przybliża mnie do innych ludzi i do przeszłości, która jest fascynująca. Dla historyka nie może być nic fajniejszego.
Wszyscy nagrywamy wywiady. Za każdym razem jest to przygoda, coś zupełnie nieprzewidywalnego, co trudno jest zaplanować. W 2009 roku tutaj w tym budynku w Instytucie Historii Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego powołaliśmy Polskie Towarzystwo Historii Mówionej, które obecnie zrzesza kilkadziesiąt osób reprezentujących różne instytucje kultury, regionalistów, archiwa historii mówionej, badaczy i badaczki dyscyplin społecznych i humanistycznych.
Historią mówioną w Polsce zajmują się bardzo różnorodne podmioty. Muzea, instytucje kultury, instytucje badawcze, ale także archiwa społeczne. Są to najczęściej małe, lokalne inicjatywy, które bardzo często zaczynają właśnie od gromadzenia nagrań, gromadzenia wywiadów, a ich celem jest zachowanie lokalnego dziedzictwa i historii. Centrum Archiwistyki Społecznej jest instytucją, która wspiera te podmioty, prowadzi dla nich warsztaty, uczy, jak zbierać historie mówione, ale też promuje właśnie lokalne dziedzictwo i tak zwane małe ojczyzny.
Nagrywaniem wideo wywiadów historii mówionej zajmuję się od 2010 roku w ramach działalności Fundacji Dobra Wola. Naszym celem jest działanie na rzecz zmiany społecznej. Nagrywaliśmy wywiady w różnych językach. W języku polskim, ukraińskim, słowackim, czeskim, łemkowskim, śląskim, a także w góralskim. Zaczynałam od działalności w organizacjach pozarządowych, od aktywizmu, który był skierowany do społeczności, przede wszystkim do kobiet i miał na celu pokazywanie prawdziwego życia kobiet i prawdziwego oblicza historii.
Jestem kierowniczką Archiwum Historii Mówionej w Domu Spotkań z Historią. Archiwum to prowadzimy wspólnie z Fundacją Ośrodka Karta. Karta zainicjowała powstanie tego archiwum i zrealizowała pierwsze projekty, które do archiwum trafiły. Już pod koniec lat 80. ruch społeczny skupiony wokół podziemnej karty zaczął akcję nagrywania polskich obywateli, dawnych mieszkańców wschodnich terenów II Rzeczpospolitej, którzy byli represjonowani przez władze sowieckie. I właśnie z tych nagrań powstały takie dwa solidne filary naszego archiwum, tak zwane Archiwum Wschodnie i Archiwum Opozycji. I od tamtej pory, a w przypadku Domu Spotkań z Historią od 2006 roku, nieprzerwanie nagrywamy relacje świadków historii.
Polskie Środowisko Historii Mówionej ma swoje czasopismo naukowe, Wrocławski Rocznik Historii Mówionej, w którym publikujemy wyniki badań naukowych, które prowadzimy z wykorzystaniem historii mówionej, a także źródła i informacje o tym, co ciekawego w Polsce i w świecie dzieje się w historii mówionej. Relacje, które nagrywamy, wspomnienia naszych świadków historii, to często wielogodzinne opowieści pełne szczegółów, emocji, rozmaitych wrażeń i doświadczeń z przeszłości. Przygotowujemy je do druku w edycjach naukowych, w wyborach fragmentów podyktowanych jakoś tematycznie, po to, żeby udostępnić je jak najszerszemu gronu odbiorcy, po to, żeby ludzie mogli zapoznawać się z doświadczeniami innych ludzi, którzy budowali naszą przeszłość, a przez to budują naszą teraźniejszość.
Stowarzyszenie daje nam nie tylko możliwość spotykania się, inspirowania, szkolenia, ale także promowania historii mówionej w przestrzeni publicznej. Od samego początku stawiamy sobie za cel doskonalenie standardów metodologicznych i etycznych w praktykowaniu historii mówionej. Wypracowaliśmy pionierskie w obszarze nauk humanistycznych i społecznych rekomendacje etyczne, które staramy się promować wśród osób nagrywających wywiady, przede wszystkim biograficzne. Sami się szkolimy, spotykając się na warsztatach. Organizujemy też treningi dla praktyków historii mówionej z całej Polski. Dzielimy się też swoim doświadczeniem z zagranicą.
Historia to nie jest tylko to, co jest napisane w podręcznikach, ale także to, co przeżyli ludzie. Ludzkie biografie, ludzkie emocje, to, czego historia oficjalna nie pokazuje.
And now we would like to welcome Professor Ewelina Szpak from the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, who will announce the first Keynote Lecturer. Please, Ewelina.
Thank you. Thank you, Kuba. Dear guests, I have a great pleasure to be here and to introduce our first keynote speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mary Marshall Clark, director of the Columbia University Center for Oral History Research at INCITE and the co-founder of Columbia's Oral History Master of Arts program. Please let me briefly say more about our marvelous guest. Mary Marshall has been at the forefront of the oral history movement since the early 1990s. She served as president of the U.S. Oral History Association and has led a number of great groundbreaking projects, including the Major Oral History Initiative on the attack of September 11, 2001, and their aftermath in New York City. She also founded the Guantanamo Rule of Law Oral History Project and continues to shape the field through Columbia's Summer Institute in Oral History. As an editor with Columbia University Press, she has brought many important works to publication, among them After the Fall, New Yorkers Remember September 11, 2001 and the years that followed. She's also co-author of the Human Rights Guide, documenting and interpreting conflicts through oral history. Alongside her contributions to oral history, Mary Marshall is currently training working as a psychoanalyst at the National Institute for Psychotherapies in New York City. Today, she will deliver her keynote lecture entitled Rememory and Repair in a World of Collective Trauma. Dear ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mary Marshall Clark, please.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And thank you for all your kindnesses in getting me organized.
It's a pleasure.
Would
you like to sit or stand?
Stand.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I?
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be with you today. I can't tell you how much I'm impressed by everyone I've met in Poland so far. And also Jakub was at our 2017 Summer Institute in Oral History we had at Columbia on the subject of health and narrative. And I remember very well his presentation of his PhD thesis and how he was talking about he hoped it would turn into a book. And now I have the great news that it might be translated in English. So just on that level alone, he was so impressive. He made such an impression. I can literally rewind my memory to exactly what he said during that institute, and it's really tremendous to be here at his invitation. So the only reason I'm going to be coherent is that I'm so jet lagged. Otherwise, I would be very nervous. But I think I've had 4 hours of sleep in the last couple of days. It's just wonderful and such an honor to be here. And a title so provocatively interesting, rethinking oral history. That makes me rewind in my own memory to meeting the first oral historians I met, which I happen to be in a cab with today, Michael Frisch and Alessandro Bertelli. And as usual, I'm the sandwich generation. I'm the 1.5 generation. So as usual, I was sandwiched in between these two giants in oral history. And I just love the fact that they're still talking about the same things they talked about when I first met them. So Alessandro says, it's really all about listening, isn't it, Michael? And Michael said, yes, that's what I've been saying. It's all about listening. So nothing has changed, and yet everything has changed. We're at such a precipice in our world that I'm really so grateful to the Ukrainians who made it here, and so sad for the Palestinians who could not. I feel that it's very important we acknowledge those who can't come, as well as celebrate those who are here. And after all, we've been an association globally before we even had the title, International Oral History Association. And we have cared about each other over the years across the continents. And that level of care is really what I want, has inspired my conversation today. As we remember and examine ourselves at the cusp of a quarter of a century of gatherings, it is really natural to rethink where have we been before. And so provocative, as we are still examining change over time and in time, individually and globally, scholars and field workers. The title is also suggestive positively that it's natural time to remember in the fullest sense of the word, to remember, to regather, and to gather up time as we revisit the past, to rethink both historical present and the future. The classic oral history inquiry about identity, who are you? Who am I? Naturally lead to the bigger question, who are we together, both in difference and in unity? That is the subject of collective memory, which has been a title itself that's been discussed and debated around the world since the beginning. To take it further, the word rethinking suggests a collective activity of remembering memory itself, including our own role as oral historians, collecting, making, and translating experiences. For we too are affected by what we do, who we interview, and the translations of those experiences into words, difficult silences, and visual and oral modes of knowledge that is meant to be made public and communicated. It can't always be made public, but that is our intention, that somehow, eventually, we interview people so that their voices can be heard. We're deeply affected by the silences and experiences that cannot be translated into words without tremendous courage and tremendous effort, both by those whom we interview and at times by our own determination. Given the importance of this conference in manifesting the necessity of rethinking who we are today in a fraught, polarized, and conflictual world, I would like to begin by honoring my mentors, sharing what they have taught so many of us in these public forums of these associations. Luisa Passerini, I would like to begin with my mentor, Luisa Passerini, a retired historian and professor from the European University in Florence, Italy, who introduced the notion of forced forgetting oral history with her book, Fascism and Popular Memory, The Cultural Memory of the Turin Working Class, published in 1987. In this book, she turned to the work of unraveling absolute silences, the loss of memory from the factory workers she was interviewing after the period of fascism, whom she discovered through her interviews routinely forgot most details of decades of their life afterwards. To uncover these memories partially buried, but still woundingly alive, she used psychoanalytic techniques, such as the interpretation of dreams, for example, to help them recover their subjectivity, themselves as subjects in a world. When I first read her work after we met, when I took her course at the New School of Social Research in New York City in 1990, I was astonished by thinking about how oral history could be transformed from its then status as data. I was then working at the New York Times doing interviews and doing oral history, into something very different, into interpersonal communication. I use that word deliberately because it's a psychological, psychoanalytic word, as well as the truth of what we do. And that psychoanalysis itself might have a seat at the table of constructing memory that addresses psychic wounds created by historical events. This, to me, seemed a fascinating use of interdisciplinarity to deepen our field, but in those days, there was abject horror expressed, at least in the U.S. Oral History Association. When you mentioned the word psychoanalysis or psychologist, it was very feared that we should not go into that deep subjective realm. So meeting Luisa was truly, having her as a teacher was truly transformative. In terms of her legacy, we are reminded to ensure in our interviews how memory is specific, to recover that specificity, especially when it's covered over by silence, as she demonstrated so well in her interviews with factory workers. Fascism occludes personal and social identity, she taught me. Oral history builds it back up. The latter is crucial to the purpose of memory itself. Without history, it is literally impossible to locate and transfer meaning, so we have to know those details. Even if we're looking at the palimpsests of memory, we have to pass our hands over those erasures. She writes in Autobiography of a Generation in the chapter Choosing to be Orphans. This book, by the way, is a journal of her psychoanalysis itself, which was very radical to appear in the field of oral history. So this is literally a conversation she takes from her analyst. I have no roots. I have no memory of any origins that resemble me. My mother is an absence. Her mother died when she was 6. I only have negative memories of her, someone who gets irked because she cannot grasp my straight hair to curl with her curling iron. She had MS. Who gets annoyed because I won't tell her whether there's any mail or not. These scenes take place before I was 5. She died when I was 6, after long spells in the hospital. In the sociological and cultural symbolic language of psychoanalysis, her analyst, Dr. G, listened attentively before saying, they're like withered roots. There's been a mutilation. I lament, she says. No, and atrophy. This story is not only the story of her own mother, it is a metaphor for the atrophy and pain of her mother's generation. The fact that there wasn't considered a generation specific to women. The root was there, but it was also damaged. Choosing to be orphans in the book requires facing the fact that a generation has been destroyed by fascism and must reinvent itself to continue existing, to reawaken from atrophy. It is the reason for doing oral history and writing and performing it. It is important to remember that Pasolini's social and autobiographical memoir was translated into a play that became very popular in Italy. She writes further that life histories are essential to the repair of memory in Europe and Italy. At the roots of our memory in dozens of life histories, I find a rupture. The subject matter of these narratives is the Italy of post-World War II period, the years of its childhood and adolescence, a country divided by 20 years of fascism and a civil war that cut across families, leaving deep wounds that demand exhumation as well as examination and repair, and eventually reparations. I can't possibly acknowledge the depth of the work that Luisa Pasolini has done and the numbers of books that she's written, but her work has continued most recently into a project called Bodies Across Borders, in which she entertained many of us who were interested in documenting and writing the stories of migration in a summer institute co-sponsored in 2017 by Columbia and by the European University. Her insistence on autobiographical memory in the context of generational memory, connecting the two things, reclaims the autobiographical root to demonstrate the existence of the individual in the context of a generation that would otherwise disappear. So back to the subject, this fraught subject of collective memory. Without individual memory, there can be no social or collective memory formed. This symbolic, I take this also from Alessandro Bertelli's work. The symbolic linking of the self through the autobiographical genre and the society is the genius of her book. And I've seen it influence students to take themselves seriously as subjects in history or interviewing other subjects in history. This is something that's changed in the years that I've been at Columbia, where initially, when I first came there in 1990, my subjecthood, my identity, was of no interest in the definition of oral history, which would be explained by me taking the life history of another. And I remember my beloved mentor, employer, Ron Grayley, whom some of you will remember, saying to me one day, your interviews are different than mine. And he said, I bet you've had people who cry in your interviews. I said, have you? He said, not one person. And I said, everybody cries in my interviews. Not because I'm a mean person, just because I think I gave permission. Eventually somebody did cry in his interviews when we were interviewing lawyers who were trying to defend prisoner rights in Guantanamo. And he broke down as he was interviewing someone. But things have really changed. Despite the contradictions of the kind of pressures that students feel to do the right thing, to absent themselves from the story, they are learning now to not do that and to, accept that they too will influence the interview. I think also the work of Jakub in recording the generations of children's memory and the worst of fascism is just about the worst of fascism is just so inspirational that I want to call him out again and thank him for that work. So recovery and reparation as a theme for us in this conference. Recovery and by extension reparation has been an aspect of oral history remembrance and accountings that have been symbolically represented in truth commissions and similar forums. We do know that also truth commissions don't always work, as Angie Krog's brilliant book about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission showed. So we do have to be mindful of what we're doing that is working and all that we're doing to prevent things from working. I think both things. We also need to acknowledge, and again, this would have been a radical statement 30 years ago, we acknowledge that accountability and social healing can be a part of documentary work. We also know that the lack of that intentionality define whether or not oral history is ethical or not, which is still a major consideration of all the oral history associations, as we saw in this beautiful film you previewed this morning. One only has to look at a recent publication by my great colleague Anna DeLilio, The Strongest Link, an oral history of wartime rape, survivors in Kosovo, published as a part of the Oxford series, to see that oral history plays a highly ethical role in the telling of truthful narratives. Despite, or perhaps because of the difficulty she had initially in getting this work published, it's a courageous example of both how hard it is to listen and how our ethics demand that we do. Our students, in fact, the ones I'm teaching now at Columbia, are drawn to oral history because of its ethical rigor. One young student exclaimed in my class last week in referring to interviews where traumatic experiences are involved, she just calmly said, in the context of the class, oral history work is defined by a curiosity that must always align with our values. And I said, wow, you've been here for 3 weeks and you've said one of the most profound things I've ever heard anybody say in the field. With students like this who learn so quickly from the pioneers in our movement, we have good reason to believe that oral history will stay not only in the realm of ethics, but in the realm of justice, from the moment of creation of the interview to the archiving, writing, and performance of such stories. In fact, the younger generations in oral history are teaching us about how to think about the future as they negotiate their own subjective relationships to those whom they will memorialize and honor to develop their own trajectories. It is not a surprise that a theme of all of Luisa Passerini's work is the theme that oral history is a form of communication. We have a few people here from Columbia today, and Chris Panza is one of them, and he's leading us beautifully to understand that. He's both a graduate of our program and in charge of communications. And this is something new and something very special in the field, that we've used technology for our own purposes to record, to preserve, but now people like Chris and others, many people at Columbia and other places, are using it as a way to form new forms of communication, not just to reach larger audiences, but to create a more intimate space for reflection as you're listening or watching to the interview. Well, if we're talking about communication as a part of oral history, I have to turn to my other major mentor and friend, Alessandro Bertelli. In his lifelong career to build for all of us a metaphorical house of memory that we can walk through as we listen to his presentations and as we learn from his experiences. I would say, so I was in his master class this morning, and he said something that's just jeopardizing my whole presentation, because I describe him as one of the best field workers I've ever met. And he says, you know, I'm not a field worker this morning. I'm not quite sure what that means, because whenever I'm listening to Sandro, I'm thinking of the spaces that he's standing in, metaphorically and literally, because he's describing them. When he goes into a home in Harlan County, he tells you what the table is covered with. He tells you about the dust. He tells you about the food. He tells you about having to find a chair that didn't have anything on it so he could sit down and relax. So I feel that I am transported into his interviews with him. In taking us into those landscapes, we're reminded that the palimpsests of memory that figure into how memory consolidates is interrogated and reconstructed, this is through his work, to fit the desire for ideological closure. So as most of you know, his work, like that of Luisa Pastorini, has been focused on the post-fascism period in Italy. It is this, the fascist rendering of collective memory as state memory, that Portelli rejects in favor of living memory. And we had our first debate about that in Brazil. I can't remember the year, but 25 years ago, 20 years ago. Messy and broken as it is, understanding temporality, how form and meaning is reshaped through time, is his gift to the oral history world, particularly meaningful in today's times. Nowhere is this more relevant and evident than in his beautiful written book, The Order Has Been Carried Out, History, Memory, and Meaning of a Nazi Massacre in Rome. Through hundreds of interviews and thousands of stories, Portelli walks us through the streets of Rome over 6 decades of memory. Framed against the memory that he's working on is addressing the misremembrance of a small partisan attack on the Nazis in which they supposedly issued an order for the small number of partisans involved to turn themselves in. And it turns out that, in fact, the massacre had already been ordered, had already been completed before the order was posted. So the memory that the partisans were to blame was so believed to be the truth for half a century that the publication of his book in 1999 caused an uproar until those who had lived through the grief of memory and loss, in large part the widows, were vindicated by the historical evidence that this book revealed. Now I'll get more personal about the mentorship. This book has a very special place in my own thinking about oral history and leading the center's work beginning in the summer of 2001. I had read the English galleys of the book in the spring of 1999 in an effort to find an American publisher, and the framework for chronicling memory of disaster that relied on first-hand witnesses was firmly set in my mind when the September 11th attacks happened in New York. So from the very beginning, this was a project I carried out with my great colleague, Peter Bearman, starting 4 days after the event. Already in my mind was an architectural framework that we would learn from people directly within 48, 58, 68 hours of the events happening, from the language that had not all been stamped and framed with media terrorism approaches, which were by that time already very firmly put in place, so that one broadcaster announced that the country was at war within 35 minutes after the falling of the towers. That kind of consolidation of memory is something that's very frightened and very ubiquitous in the world that we live in, as you can see. So the idea was that first-hand witnesses be able to, what? Not only report, not only document, not only witness, but interpret the meaning of these events for themselves. So we didn't ask questions about where were you, what happened. We asked life history questions. We asked one gentleman, an Afghan man who had been in one of the towers. His son was in Pakistani, was in the other. And our interviewer, Jerry, said, "We'd like to know a little bit about your life history and how you came to be who you are today." He said, "Well, we would have to start 400 years ago." And the interviewer luckily said, "I have all day." And after 7 hours, they got to his birth. So by that point, I think people understood that we were seeing them as the people we were relying on, the selves that we were relying on to tell us the story of a gigantic event that had reverberations very negatively around the world. But we don't need to stay in Europe to learn about the transformative moments in the International Oral History Association. Ron Greeley, my predecessor and I proposed an oral history conference before the existence of the formal establishment of the association at the Siena meeting. We proposed this in '93, that we would have a conference in New York in 1994 so that Africans and Latin Americans and South Americans could come. And I will never forget one woman standing up and say, "You shall not have an official oral history association outside of Europe." And it would never happen in the United States. So though we had an associate, and then Luisa Passerini stood up and said, "That's ridiculous. I'm going to New York next year." So another way in which she kind of saved the day. But though we had no official status and we don't appear on the list of the 23 conferences, nearly 500 people gathered that September in New York. And the diversity was amazing with participation, huge amount of participation from around the world. The IOHA has grown so much in celebrating the oral history world strength and diversity. The great conference in 2004 in Rome, the great conference here with all its diversity and membership for so many different communities and cultures and nations. I also must say, since this is an ego histoire about my own development, that I can't leave the question of mentorship without mentioning my Brazilian friends, especially Sebe Bomehe, who demonstrated the power of in-depth fieldwork in oral history by doing life histories in Brazil. And when he came to New York for joining us as a Rockefeller Fellow for 12 months, he worked in 8 or 9 hours a day. He sat in laundromats on Amsterdam Avenue interviewing mostly Dominican and some Brazilian migrants on their dreams of a nation that they were coming to. What were their dreams and fantasies of where they were going and who they would be in this new world? And later I found out he was doing this psychoanalytic work because he was a Jungian. So he was a historian, but he's also a Jungian. So he was interpreting dreams in the same way that Luisa Passerini was interpreting them from a different angle, of course. She Freud, he Jung. But the idea that the unconscious belongs in oral history is come to fruition gradually and slowly over the years. But I think it belongs here. I think we encounter the unconscious in almost everyone we interview if we really listen to them and don't prepare too many questions. This year we were so fortunate to continue our relationship with Brazil. Richard Santiago was part of our conference in New York called Standing Up for Democracy, Oral and Social and Political Change in Our Times. We're a bunch of courageous people, you know. This is just one example of how we as oral historians meet together, nourish each other, and change each other. And we rely on each other to stay honest. So, as I said earlier, I'm part of a weird generation in oral history. I have giants who came before me, giants who are coming after me. Thank you, Amy Starczewski. But I really am still thinking about the generational base for change. And I'm hoping that part of my work over the years is to respect that change over generations and to honor the generations that came before us and will come after us. There's a woman named Alexis Pauline Gumbs who documents the wonderful work of Audre Lorde, the Black lesbian Caribbean poet. And she's written a book about Audre Lorde called Survival is a Promise. And I think it is. I think that's a contribution to the field. Remember, what do I think? I mean, I wanted to mention also the work of post-memory Marianne Hirsch and so many of you here are doing, which is also a very valid and exciting way of doing oral history once the survivors have gone. But I guess what I want to say is I'm maybe also, because I'm becoming a psychoanalyst, because I've read so much material now in the field of psychoanalysis globally about memory and about how we internalize the memories that we help people create, and they then internalize them. There's a beautiful phrase that Toni Morrison, who wrote in Beloved, she coined, called rememory. And that's what I would like to introduce for us to think about today. It's amazing, of course, to ask this question in Krakow, where life and death existed side by side, intertwined, until you amazing historians and oral historians work together to establish a ground from which we can continue to learn. So if we talk about rememory, we're involving the work of Toni Morrison, one of our finest storytellers, African-American storytellers in the United States. She illustrates its meaning through her creation of her book, Beloved, the story of a slave, Sete, who facing the ultimate dilemma of whether to allow her child or one of her infants to be enslaved or to let that infant pass away. She chose to let that infant pass away. This, of course, is a feature, the idea of a ghost coming back to witness to that moment of absolute trauma, is a way of witnessing to the collective existence of slavery. And she felt necessary to do that. So we must go back to the literal, physical, and psychic site of the crime. Rememory is a process of bringing back difficult and impossible physical memories of enslaved people in her work to gradually allow for the wearing away of trauma. Sete's memory of murdering her infant to protect her from the ravages of slavery are part of a history that is unspeakable and yet cannot be erased. To suggest otherwise would be a heretical act, but in the gathering of women who surround Sete, as the memory is reconstructed into a felt memory, a memory of sorrow, a memory of mourning, a memory of acknowledgement of the larger structures of slavery, is what is to me the closest definition we ever may get to what is collective memory in oral history. It's the willingness to re-experience the worst, but it's so, like Passerini, Portelli, DeLilio, and others have demonstrated, because it's almost unimaginable and unspeakable. That's why we gather together, to imagine it and to speak it, if only by analogy. We accept, of course, that we're listening to ghosts. In the case of so many lives, structures of slavery are less visible now, but still palpable. To restore temporality to those who have been murdered and shamed, we have to sit still and remember slowly. That's what we have to do through our bodies as well as our minds. This is a different kind of listening where we imagine literally that we're in body of another. Morrison writes, I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do, but it's not. Places are still there. If a house burned down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around out there outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or saw is right out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Asked Denver, the child of Sete, another child. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'll be walking around the road and you hear something or see something going on. So clear, and you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a rememory that belongs to someone else. Cleone White, a Jamaican-born psychoanalyst, writes in her article, Memory, Rememory, Dupies and Time, when reflecting on how relevant Morrison is to the work of survival. She writes that Jamaican dupies, or ghosts, are central to the cultural identity that defines mental health. She writes that the memory work Marson accomplishes is a form of collective memory and healing in action. She says it's not just an effort to find out the way history really was. That's research. Rememory, instead, is a form of willed creation in which the self is not only recovered, but restored. This, to me, is absolutely hopeful as well as it is saddening, because it gives us a trajectory, a way to, and I've seen it with some of my patients, I've seen it with many of my friends, a way to understand that in facing, trying to speak the unspeakable or facing the difficulty, we find something in ourselves that we can share with another. And the beauty of her definition of collective memory is that we can only remember together. They are, as she puts it, transcendental ghosts or dupias are transcendental umbilical connections to a history lived as unmetabolized lost. Might they, in our unconscious, play an important mediating role as elements in and of themselves with which to renegotiate time and memory and therefore to effect transformation? If we let them, this is my phrase, these ghosts, if we let them in, they may help decolonize us. The idea of bumping into ghosts and welcoming ghosts in our midst today as we continue to develop the oral history through rememory is very similar to the work that my predecessors have done, Michael Frisch in particular, in talking about shared memory. Here at this unique conference, and in Krakow, we're accompanied by many friendly and eager ghosts, perhaps as yet unregistered for this conference. Maybe we'll see them tonight. We welcome them, we will name them, we will celebrate them as we reflect on the power of listening to stories from the bottom up, in the body, and in material life that continues to transform us. The works of rememory abound in our field if we just look around. One of my former student, Tomoko Hiramoto from Japan, wrote a thesis called Restoring Testimonies, Rediscovering the Individual Unfolding Memory, and Hibakusha narratives. The Hibakusha were the ones who experienced the nuclear bomb. And she was very determined, and she found them and asked them to speak to her, and they refused for many years until gradually she and others got them to speak. And the way she made this exhibit at our Columbia exhibit hall was that she had individual photographs of their faces, and then we would hear their voices. And somehow you felt that transformation happening almost tangibly. I think that what we see in our students' work now is that the work of oral history can be metabolized, can become tangible, can become visual, can become performative, and those are all natural ways of spreading the word. Another student, former student, inspiration friend is Fanny Garcia, and I will never forget when she as a student recognized that her work on Separated, where she was interviewing people who were undocumented, could not be represented by their name or their faces or the sound of their voices. Maybe it was the sound of their voices, she'll correct me. But she came in one day with a photograph of the hand of a person she had interviewed. This simple image had infinite meanings, finite but infinite, which is the nature of oral history. And symbolizing that was her genius. She still works so hard and so well in this field, allowing people to express memory while respecting their rights to retain their own histories and their own subjectivities until the time when they're safe enough to share. In the honor of naming what it is we do for ourselves and our narrators and the publications and other forms of collective meaning making, I just want to conclude by sharing some definition of rememory so we can hold it onto it as principles in our work. Toni Morrison created this term rememory, but many have studied it. She created it not through the direct narration of the incident, but by the use of a ghost to remember something that is intangible and unspeakable. Rememory is a psychological and a narrative act because it tells a story that has resonance with others who've experienced similar traumas. Morrison warns us that we can only understand and repair the self in and through community. Cleone White reasserts that point in her writings about Morrison. Discrete scenes in Beloved only become coherent through interpersonal relationships that are woven together there, in which subjectivity is felt and holdable. Rememory is both a noun and a verb. When time, memory intersect, and rememories can be shared and live together, making genuine collective memory possible only when our share our stories with each other. Repair can happen in the shared context of listening, so that fear and terror no longer contain the imprisoned memory, formerly imprisoned memory, and the shared joy and communication can be released into the present, into the now, preserving a pathway to the future. Rememory ensures the transfer of meaning across generations, cultures, and time. Thank you so much for the honor of speaking with you, and I welcome all the ghosts bumping into each other tonight and for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Marshall. I think that we will start the discussion, so maybe you would like to sit down just to, and before I open this public discussion, I would like to first thank you for this very brilliant and thought-provoking lecture. I think that your presentation has shown that oral history through the lens of rememory is not only the tool for documenting traumatic experiences, but also an ethical and communicative practice aimed at repair, intergenerational transfer of meaning, and the creation of collective memory. And having this in mind, I would like to ask two questions, two very general questions, I think, but maybe the one is more practical. So knowing that you have this psychoanalytic training, and most of oral historians don't have it, and work without such resources, such experience, relying primarily on empathy and intuition. So how can we responsibly engage with what you call the unspeakable aspect of trauma without risking re-traumatization? So asking other way, how can we build resilience in our narrators while accessing the most vulnerable part of their identity?
Well, that, of course, is a brilliant question, and thank you for it. I want to be very modest here and say that most of what I've been talking about, I've learned through reading psychoanalytic work and reading novels. I'm in a wonderful book club, so a lot of my real learning happens there. And so somehow it occurred to me that what happens in Beloved is universal. I mean, so many of us are documenting the wound, the trauma, and just by being present to the other person, we can never become psychoanalysts as oral historians. That's not what I'm suggesting. But by being present, and this is true of both clinical work and oral history work, we can absorb some of the unmetabolized grief, sadness, and terror of others. Sometimes it's not saying anything. Sometimes it's allowing the person who's expressed a memory to sit with it with us in silence. Sometimes, as in after September 11th, we were lucky enough when our interviewers started becoming overwhelmed by the amount of sorrow they were hearing, to have psychologists who sat with us as interviewers to tell us these are questions you maybe should ask and these are questions maybe you shouldn't ask. So there are times after mass trauma when you do want to, they also provided through grants 16 free sessions of psychotherapy, trauma-focused, to everyone we interviewed, and also to our interviewers. And we didn't keep records of any of that, of course, because that was private information, but we were told that many of our interviewers took the time to go and speak with them. So I see it more as an alignment rather than a collusion, rather than a melding of two different kinds of strategies. I think I just want to say, I think there's a tremendous overlap between the fields that's been ignored out of a kind of American knee-jerk reaction, often I've seen in the oral history movement in the United States, to the idea that we can't touch anything that's traumatic. We're trying to build archives, and that's not relevant. I think that's changed a lot also, and through the great work of advocacy that the younger generation is doing. They're very responsible. They're trying to help people with their lives, their actual practical lives. And stepping out into the framework of being an advocate is also similar to a psychological act of listening. But my point is really that whether we think we are or not, we're encountering the ghost of trauma in those whom we interview. We may have the idea that we're not because we're not trained, but they still have those feelings and those responses. So the very least we can do is acknowledge them.
Yes, thank you. And the second question is maybe more connected with current situation and many crises that many countries face right now. In the context of today's polarized societies, where communication itself is increasingly fraught and contested, what do you see as the key challenge and risk of practicing oral history as a form of dialogue and collective meaning making?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part.
So I'm going to read that again. In the context of today's polarized societies, where communication itself is increasingly fraught and contested, what do you see as the key challenges and risk of practicing oral history as form of dialogue and collective meaning making?
Yeah.
Are there risks?
I'm so glad you mentioned dialogue, because I think that that is also what some of the truth commissions and your network in particular is so important to support dialogue, that the idea of the interview is too small. We really should be talking about dialogue and preserving the rigor of dialogue. And I'm sure you would have a lot to teach us about that.
I'm sure that you would teach us more. So, yes. So I think that these are two general questions that I would like to start with, and now I would like to open our public discussion. So please, if you have any questions, comments, please raise your hands. We have microphones, so please do that. Are there any questions? Yes, we have.
Thank you, Mary Marshall, for that. Hi, everyone. I'm in the way back here. Catherine Nastrom.
I'm
Mary
having
Marshall,
trouble hearing you.
Could you speak up?
Mary Marshall is someone who loves to read novels and had actually, in my own mind, never put novels and psychoanalysis together. Would you say more about the connections and the richness that you see there?
I would love to. I mean, I really appreciate that. Growing up in a small town in rural North Carolina with not much access to a formerly rigorous education, I learned everything about the world that I learned through reading in all the libraries I could find. So it's always been my primary understanding of how to understand the world. Like I knew I couldn't get out of that place, or I felt that I couldn't. So I decided to learn as much as I could about the world. And finally, I settled on novels. And I think that there's a very strong relationship, which I would like to write about someday, between novels in what we do in oral history, in terms of letting characters emerge and change in the context of our understanding of their life histories. Seeing people as complicated representations of not just themselves, but as a gentleman from Pakistan told us, you'd have to know 400 years of my history to understand how I would react to September 11th. And in novels, there's always a tension between the writer and the characters that she introduces. Each character wants her own time, each character demands her own place, and part of our jobs as listeners, either as a writer or as a listener, is to pull these characters together in ways that don't collapse them into subjugated identities, but allow them to find their voices as it's transpiring in the novel, like all of Toni Morrison's work, for example. I'm in a book club that we primarily read only African American Caribbean novels and African novels. And so they have the characters in these stories and the elegant ways in which the writers allow them room to grow and to link with each other in the representations, to me is the way an oral history should unfold. If we see ourselves as a kind of an author in an oral history where we're going to meet many, many characters, judging how and when, how long to let them have their say, when to introduce a contrasting perspective, when do I ask a question as an interviewer, when do I say, I don't understand, you know, or when do I ask the question, why? So I haven't fully written this out, but I think that we can learn a lot from literature about how to think about oral history, as Bortelli has taught us so well.
Okay.
I know that there are also questions, yes, so
Aaron.
Hello. I just have a quick question. I love when you mentioned that oral history kind of switched in your mind from being something called like data-like, into something more like interpersonal communication. So my question to you, it is very broad, but I'm just curious if you could elaborate at which point data collection or information collection becomes an art form for you.
Sorry, could you say once again, because it was hard to understand from this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So this is a broad question, but at which point does data collection or information collection become an art form for you?
Actually, when I was 10 years old,
Mike.
my first oral history. When I was 10 years old, I came from a family of singers and musicians in part, and they would always have tape recorders out on the living room table in my grandmother's house. And so to me, the tape recorder was the active agent in telling, and eventually they would interview us as children, either 2 or 3 or 5 or 6, and we would hear our voices on the tape. So to me, this was the way you learned. And so by the time I was 10, it took me a year, but I saved enough money to be able to buy an $80 portable tape recorder. And I was hanging out in my father's office. He ran an insurance business in this poor little town, and a very iconic character named Albert would stop by, and it turns out that Albert Blaisdon, who was indigenous and white, believed that he was the prophet Elijah come back to life. He lived in his truck, and he painted his truck with pictures from the Bible. He was actually a great painter of Elijah returning to earth. And so he stopped by the office quite a lot because he trusted my father, even though he normally would not interact with white people in the town. And his stories were so fantastical. I was just curious where they came from. So one day, I was very shy, but I overcame my shyness and asked him, would you mind if I recorded some of your stories? And he looked at me with this suspicion in his eye. And I said, oh, take time to think about it. He said, I will. He came back 2 days later and he told me that if I would record his stories, he would give me permission if I would teach him how to read and write. So he wanted to learn to read and write so he could read the Bible and write down his visions. So it took 2.5 years, but he gave me 100 hours of stories, and I taught him how to read and write. And he produced, my father and I, on the mimeograph machine, produced little storybooks of his visions, and he took off in his trailer and I think lived on the West Coast after that. But that was the original transmission between orality and literacy, between orality and writing, and figuring out how to transcribe those stories helped me learn the art of oral history, because though many of his stories didn't make rational sense, the way in which he told them told me how to transcribe them. The tone of his voice, the slowness or speed of his speech. And so later on I went to a university in North Carolina, and one of my professors said, have you ever done oral history? And I said, well, I have 100 hours of tape. And so I brought them to Chapel Hill, and my professor and I took them to psychology, and they said, I'm sorry, but this man is psychotic. They took him to sociology, no interest whatsoever. And, you know, so finally we decided to do our own analysis through hermeneutics. And so learning how to tell those stories again, how to hear them again, and how to analyze them according to the meaning that he made in them, according to their form, was the way I learned the art of oral history. But I think everybody in our field has, you know, if you look at the titles that have come out of the publishers, many times the art of listening is there. The word art is used over and over. I think it is an art. It can't be taught except by listening. That's how I learned listening when I first went to Columbia. For the first 2 years, all I did was listen to other people's interviews and try to edit them. And so it can't be taught. It can be modeled, I think, but it has to come from you. The eagerness to learn. If you're not curious, you will not be able to do a good interview. You always have to be driven by a curiosity, a desire to know that will turn that experience for you and the other person into an art form, I think. I mean, I was telling Sandra, you know, I've had to interview a lot of lawyers in the last 2 years because I've been studying immigration and those deportations and things like that. And so I've done a lot of research, and, you know, it's very intimidating to interview someone who's been narrowly passed over through the Supreme Court because of his genius and his accomplishments. And I was interviewing such a person this spring, and because of his work, he was uninvited by Princeton to speak later that same day, so he was pretty upset. And I looked at him and he looked at me, and I said, you know, I've sent you all these notes and ideas and questions. We could talk about that, or if you want, you could just tell me stories. 4 hours later, he stopped. He wanted to tell his stories of what it's been like as an immigration lawyer for him, running one of the biggest organizations on the West Coast to try to save people's lives and help them. He had a lot of stories he wanted to tell. So knowing when to shut up is also part of the art of oral history.
Thanks, Mary Marshall. I hope someone is doing your oral history. I love hearing your stories. What I have found recently, the projects of my students do not focus on trauma. They're, you know, community organizations, but what I'm finding increasingly is more and more it comes up. And so I have to work with my students in preparing them, you know, not exclusively, and they all don't have it in their interviews, but I was just wondering, maybe that is also a subject in the future, that even when, you know, the focus of the project isn't trauma, that, you know, dealing with that, or, you know, I'd love to see that in one of the books that many of us educators use on teaching oral history, if you could comment on that.
Yes, I mean, I think, like I say, like we theorize somehow to ourselves, you know, that we're not interviewing people psychologically, but we're encountering their psychologies. I've never done an oral history with anyone, a life history, where there wasn't some moment in which that person had to, you know, stop for a second, metabolize what they were going through. And so what we do, how do we receive that, is what we need to learn. And what we need to respect is the ethics and principles in our guidelines are pretty darn good. Probably there needs to be more writing on how to think about how to metabolize trauma in yourself when you're interviewing someone, or when you're, very importantly, when you're teaching students how to receive that information. I mean, that's a tremendous thing, you know. So I'm not the kind of person, either as a therapist or an oral historian, who's going to go directly and ask a person about the traumas they've experienced. I believe that a life history, or as Sullivan, a great psychoanalyst, wrote about detailed inquiry, and which I use in my work with my patients, to understand their life history and the context in which they live in this world before I get to the root if it comes up of trauma. So I think that it's really about us and our own comfort level or uncomfort level, and that's what I'm trying to address, about receiving that. I think there's a tremendous work of tenderness in oral history. I have faith that most oral historians who understand the ethics and the purposes of oral history are sensitive human beings. If they're not, they should be called out and not do their work, you know. As a member of the Institutional Review Board at Columbia University for the last 25 years, I have seen some bad practices of people who are not trained as oral historians using it. And we have ways of teaching them how to do it differently. So I think at the very basis, we have very good principles in our, you know, in our associations about it. And the other thing is, trauma is overused as a word. We don't have to use the word. When somebody's talking about loss, we don't have to name it as such. We interpret that as loss, as we would with anybody, any of our friends that we hear those stories. So not over-theorizing what trauma is also very important. Everybody has some degree of it, and I'm not talking about, because I use the example of Beloved, it seems like I'm talking about the worst roots of trauma. That's not it. I mean, I think that caution and ethics and shared responsibility, making sure the person is not isolated, calling the next day or the next week, or working to interview people in the context of a community organization where there's natural protection, where people are protected. You know, we know what not to do. You know, I'm not talking about unearthing memories that are too hard for people to explore. I'm talking more about our readiness. I'm asking you to examine how ready you already are to hear a story in all its fragments. I think you are. I think we don't realize that we are, and that much of the work we do is reparative to people.
Mary, thank you so much for your talk. Cynthia over here, and very nice to see you again. You mentioned in your talk providing time for alternate perspectives, and I know that that could be especially challenging since the source of trauma is conflict, and conflict is a very complex thing. I'm wondering if you have any lessons to share that you've learned in wrangling these tensions and documenting contested memory.
Oh, that's an excellent question, and that is what the group of us who are doing, I would call human rights work. It came out of our 2012 Human Rights Oral History Summer Institute, decided to get together an international group and to meet in Turkey, to people from Eurasia, from Europe, from the United States, working on contested memories, and people from Turkey often interviewing in communities where in a family, one member was the enemy of another community. So tensions were very difficult. And so I can share that publication with Jakob. I think that we did a good job of understanding what we have in common as oral historians, and that's what we worked on there. We can make that available to you, but knowing what we can't do, knowing the kind of mega conflicts that we must avoid in order to sit at the same table and begin to listen to each other, doing it gradually, doing it slowly, asking permission to talk about a subject. I may not be getting at all at what you're asking, but I do think that oral history is a very slow process, is very suited to understanding how to document conflict, and that is the title of that publication, Documenting Oral History in Conflict, not post-conflict, but in situations of conflict. But I am not an expert. But I have been part of many different situations where I have seen it become possible. To say that it's possible to talk about conflict now in our times is almost impossible because of the polarization and the hatred and the mass media's thirst for all of that. And so I can't possibly speak to the worst of the conflicts right now because the system has broken down. We're not seeing people who are interested in repair, in rapprochement, and even in reparations. So we have a lot yet still to do.
Thank you so much for your talk.
I can't hear you at all. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for your talk. My background is in psychology and psychoanalyst, but also in memory studies, and also I'm trying to combine somehow oral history. I was doing a lot in practice with traumatized people, and then I conduct research about intergenerational transmission of war memories as such. I didn't use word trauma. And then I got a lot silences. And my question is to you, how as oral historian, when we try also to understand those silences, how we deal with silences as such? Thank you.
Can you tell me more about your difficulty?
I have difficulty because
It's not turned on.
I have difficulties because almost all of parent generation they didn't use word traumas as such,
right?
But they would during the interviews. I use biographical narrative interviews. They had many poses and many things that I saw as a silencing and trying to silence partially their stories, and they would never told their children what was happened to them, and they would try to explain to me it was active silence. It was not that they tried to repress themselves, but they would try actually to do something with this kind of silencing, not only protection, but also contesting the histories.
Yeah, now I understand better. Thank you. I don't have any specific thing to say about that in particular because I haven't worked with that kind of, but it's not unusual. The stories often skip a generation, and there are obvious reasons for that. That if the story cannot be symbolized inside the self, language is symbolic. So if there's no way to symbolize it because of the extent of the trauma, there are other methods. One of the things that Luisa Passerini has done in a project on BABE, Bodies Across Borders, was that many of the migrants were not ready to speak yet about their experiences. You can think of all the reasons why. Gassan Haag wrote a beautiful article about being homeless, and I think he's African, and how he learned as a migrant to make a home wherever he went. But that required a tremendous meta-consciousness and ability to place himself somewhere where he could do that. the groups that were interviewing these migrants that she was working with decided that instead of asking them to tell their stories, they would first ask them to draw maps of where they had journeyed. They would ask them to draw pictures. They would ask them to draw, and they did this with their families, so they all got together and would do that. And so the visual, which Louisa has always been very, very passionate about, that we should include visuality more than we ever have, which I think she's really right about. The visual act of sketching and drawing and using colors, and then later talking to interviewers about what those representations meant, allowed them, as you can see, to symbolically represent something that prior to that had to be embedded in a silence. And so I think that is important too. And also to respect people who cannot speak yet. There's a reason for that. And, you know, then at that point, you know, all you can do is try to interpret them, but not to break them. Breaking of silence is a very violent act. And I don't encourage any oral historians to go there, because it's there for a reason, you know. But it can be symbolized in other ways, in music, and I'm remembering stories from people all over the world who would stop in Columbia, because we're in New York City, so we're kind of like a global, you know, center. And I remember women coming from India, a few women who were studying at Columbia briefly, and saying that they were not allowed to protest in the public sphere. So what they did instead was sing. And so they sang their protest, and these songs became the folklore of their generation, but they also allowed them to protest, to use words, but in the form of a song, which was more acceptable. I remember encountering people from Sudan who, through our human rights program at Columbia, who were unable to, out of fear and danger, to express their life histories. And so they developed an elaborate methodology of using stones that they found in their gardens to recreate the problematic parts of their histories. A woman from Colombia joined our human rights group, and she was part of a casa that celebrated that gathered the history of women's history, indigenous women, and their stories of rape. And so they were it was unsafe for them to speak them. So what they would do, they created a mapping device called My Body, My Territory. And the women would come together in the safety of the group, and they were using embroidery, they would embroider where they were and what territory and what happened to their bodies without ever using words. And that was an incredible and moving experience. So all to say that there are many, many different forms of witnessing that are not all verbal and that are not all rational, but must be respected. That's why we have ghosts.
Ms. Clark, thank you so much for your talk. For your talk. Mark Wong from Singapore. My question is about what I picked up as what I felt to be a kind of tension that I sensed in your talk. You talked about speed of the 9/11 project, speed in order to capture something that was raw, unmediated. But you also mentioned later on in one of your answers about oral history as being inherently something slow, patient. I wonder whether you could tell us more about how you deal with time, speed, rhythms, all of these things which are very hard to manage, I think, and we can be also led by different forces, external forces, certain time pressures, financial pressures, all of that. How would you deal with time and speed and rhythm in your work? Thank you.
Could I answer that 10 years from now? That is such a great question, and I knew this would be a site of learning for me. I have to really think about that. I was The construction of the 9/11 project was due in great part to the work of my great colleague, Peter Bearman, the sociologist. We had never met beforehand. I should say as a backdrop that, well, he's really a genius at the question of design. Why do we do this now was one question. The other was, what is the design of this project? And we must attend to that rigor very carefully. So the purpose of the project was not so that we could get raw memories. The rawness of speech was of interest because we thought maybe we could get people to speak in their own language rather than that of the mass media from the very beginning. But I think that was even impossible after 4 days. So we weren't looking for the raw. We were looking for an accounting that people could give of their own lives during this period, because we had a suspicion, and Peter and I each came to that in our own way. I had worked at the New York Times, which is the mass media organization. I had worked studying Paul Lazarsfeld, who came up with the term mass media. I was very focused on media in my interviews, and Peter, the same, had worked with Paul Lazarsfeld's institute at Columbia and was very suspicious of what might happen through the mass media. So we honestly came to it with the same interest of trying to get people I don't even use the word witnesses. It was really just to get the human beings who had lived through this in New York to say what it meant to them. You also portrayed a vengeful nation, that the U.S. was vengeful and angry and willing to attack other countries, and did attack other countries. We wondered if that's how New Yorkers really felt. And so we went out to find that out. And in 85% of our narratives, which we studied through a lot of different, it was a longitudinal project, so went back a second time and a third time, we found that 85% of the people we interviewed did not change their belief systems, did not become revengeful, did not become vengeful, and were in fact very concerned about their neighbors who were Muslims and who were Jews right up against each other, and who were, poor and who were rich, that there would be some not flat, but some wisdom, some sense of what this city was before that wasn't destroyed. We found that was true. And then we brought a book 10 years later, just taking 19 of those hundreds of stories, and interesting editing process. It wasn't as hard as you would think, because the taxi driver and the first policeman at Ground Zero and an artist all felt the strength of the city under attack and did not want to lose their values in their city. So we really didn't go for the raw. But I have to tell you, talking about metabolizing a project, that project lasted, it took place over 2 or 3 years. It lasted 5 or 6 years in terms of processing all the materials. And that's where I learned that oral history is slow. So, as Sandra was saying earlier this morning in his master workshop, he questions whether everything should be fast and go on the web and all of that. So I felt after 9/11 that we were not going to put these interviews on the internet, because we had no idea of what would change in the country, whether people's voices would be misused. And so we took the very conservative decision not to share them publicly. People had to come to the library and access them there. And many people criticized us for that. But 10 years later, when we were writing the book, by that time we had been in communication with all our narrators, and I remember one of them, Gloria Jacobs, who was a big feminist at the time, or still is, but running an organization. We sent her, I asked for their legal releases so many times. I said, do you really give us consent? Are you sure you want to sign this release? Are you sure you're okay with your story being archived? And we would write letters to people. We hand delivered transcripts in the second phase. We didn't want people to have to read their interviews in the mail. So it was highly personal. So 10 years later, I asked Gloria to come talk at our summer institute, and I said, Gloria, were you worried about the release? I said, you signed it 4 or 5 times. She said, I know I signed it, but what I understood was that anybody who wanted to read my interview would bring it up to your desk, and you would sit with them while they were reading it. So I think we were right not to share those, because the personal relationships that we had developed helped people feel that we were interpersonally with them, that we were not using their stories as data, that I would patiently sit with whoever came to read Gloria's interview. So after all those signatures and whatever we could have done with the interviews, in the end, they saw it as a very personal act of trust. So I think that I wrote a little piece which I hope to expand someday, because after Katrina happened, somebody called me and said, well, we'll give you money to go do the history of Katrina. And all of these, questions about do it now or do it later came up. And I said to the Rockefeller Foundation, he called me, I said, why would you want me to do Katrina? I mean, there are 300 oral historians in the Gulf. I mean, let me give you some names of people who live there who can do it. So there's that. That makes it personal and interpersonal and intercultural. But also, I started to think about this question. Al Stein, I remember, brought it up. When is it okay to do a project? And I wrote a piece called Never Too Soon, Never Too Late. And it was a piece I hope to expand, because I think it was sound, that it's never too soon to hear from people who want to talk. Of course, if the physical danger is over. I'm not talking about situations of physical danger or political danger. But it's also never too late. Trauma has a fixed hold on memory that is hard to break. Sometimes it can only be told much later, but it is always there. 5 years after we did our 9/11 project, we had a little money left to do video. We chose not to do video in the beginning because I knew we'd spend all our money on 50 interviews, and instead we could interview 700 people instead of 50 by not spending all that money on video. And anyway, I wasn't ready to put a camera in front of people. It lacked sensitivity. So 5 years later, we had $20,000 or something like that. And so we went back to some of the people we'd interviewed, 3 months after, 6 months after, and we thought maybe their memory would have faded, but the memory was right there. It was right there in their chest. And they were ready to tell it and share it on video so they could share it with their families. We never publicized it, but they wanted a video record, and so we chose some people to do it, and they did. The memory was right there, never went away. So I think it's never too soon and never too late if you take that with common sense. The memories like that, memories instantiated by trauma do not fade. One wishes they might, but they do not, in my experience. So that doesn't begin to answer your wonderful question about time and speed. Maybe I'm just getting older and that's why I'm slower. That's why I advocate for slowness. But the slowness that we took in archiving that project, sending people letters, seeing what we could do with them, providing them with psychological support, the project was supposed to be wrapped up in 9 months. It took 5 years. And just so many people who were listening to the interviews to correct them. Transcriptionists were traumatized by transcribing them. Student workers still write me about what it meant to listen to them and not meet the people. It was a tremendously, as fast as it was also necessarily slow. And it really doesn't answer your great question, but that's the best I can do for now.
Thank you for your insightful talk. As interviews are increasingly mediated by recording devices, transcription, and digital archives. What aspects of memory risk being flattened or lost in the process? And what should we as oral historians be doing to preserve those dimensions?
And as we are running out of time, so I would like to ask you for very short, very brief answer to that, because we have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes left. So
2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay,
maybe 3.
that's fine. And I'm sorry, I'm tired. I haven't slept in 2 days. So, yeah, so I think we probably need to discuss that more at a different place. But I think one of the best things, always work in teams and have everybody in your team promise to give a talk about what they're doing at a local community center, at a library or something. I found that when I had to give talks, it was very intimidating, but it was when I came back to life and the interviews came back to life. This is what Luisa Passerini is talking about. Oral history is a form of communication. It must be communicated. And so the people who process these archives must talk, must give talks, must, unmetabolize it, must get it out of their bodies. I always felt better after I gave a speech because, it was not living in my body anymore. Towards the end of the 9 months in which we did the work, I finally realized it was my duty to give a talk to all the interviewers, 30-some people, and others who had supported us. And so I spent 4 months listening and reading back in the archive until I found certain themes that seemed to me to make sense, that I could give back to what people had given us. I'll never forget how hard that was, or how satisfying when the interviewers looked up and was like, thank you for doing this work of listening back to what we did. We need that. The transmission of memory is so vital to our health, to our experiences of joy as well as trauma. Continuing to tell is the essence of oral history.
Thank you. I think that it's time for a break. So I would like to thank you all for your presence and for your involvement and inspiring discussion. And most of all, I would like to thank Mary Marshall-Clark for her brilliant talk and discussion. So thank you all once again.